Today is the third and final sermon in our 3-week series on this epidemic in our culture of suicide, this darkness that has come upon us that is literally moving people to take their lives. And it's not easy talking about these things over the past 3 weeks, but I think it's important. I mean, what a world we live in where the number one cause of death of young people now is suicide. So we've been talking about that. What can we do? How can we respond? What is it that God is asking us to do? Just as a brief recap, the first week was what I called assessing the danger. When we go into a new place or uncharted territory, we need to look to see where the danger might lie so that we can not fall into that danger. And I think with all that's happened in our world in the last year or so, I'm not sure that we accurately identified where the danger lies. And in our culture, there's dangers there for people that maybe we perhaps haven't given enough sort of credence to how dangerous things are out there for us. Things like media and et cetera. You can go back and look at that later. I'm not going to give that sermon again. Then last week, talked about what I call assessing the harm. If you fall off a ladder or you're in a car wreck, you need to stop and assess, like, am I hurt? Like, where am I hurt? Am I okay? And I invited all of us to do that. How are you was the question last week. How are you really doing? And if anybody needs any help, there's nothing wrong with asking for saying, gosh, I think I am depressed, or I think I need to talk to somebody, or whatnot. We need to be willing to ask for help when it's needed. So that we can now be an instrument to help others. And today is the conclusion, and really my message today is to be one of what can we do? How can we be hope to people who might not know that there's hope any longer? People who might really be struggling. And the answer is really simple. The answer is simple. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor is the answer. Now that might sound overly simplistic, but bear with me here. I think the times are ripe for Christianity to once again show itself for what it really is, as a light to the world, and as the answer, as the solution to so many of the problems and difficulties that are out there. And it is rooted firstly in this love of neighbor, which is the command of our blessed Lord, to love your neighbor. I say that because there are people out there, especially those who maybe are on that path, that dark path that may end in a very bad end. They are believing that they're not loved, that there's no hope for them, nobody cares about them. That's not true. But do they know that? They will if all of us Christians love our neighbors. That's what I mean. Like, we have a chance now to change the world in a profound way. That we would be those people who love our neighbors. That we would be those people who bear witness like Jesus did and give profound witness in a current culture where loving our neighbor is not the way we live. We're not living in a world of love your neighbor anymore. Which is why I say Christianity now, it's right for Christianity again to rise. And when I say love your neighbor, I don't mean that we have to be best friends with our neighbors, that we have to agree with our neighbors, that we have to no longer care about truth and justice and all those things. I'm not talking about that at all. But I'm just talking about loving your neighbor. Like literally, desiring their greatest good for your neighbor. How powerful it would be for us as a church again to bear witness to love your neighbor, living the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. That'd be great. What does it mean to love your neighbor? That question was posed to Jesus Christ. Jesus was proclaiming, you need to love your neighbor. And he had his disciples right here next to him, And then over here were the chief priests and the elders and the Pharisees, and he was telling them that they need to love their neighbor, that this is what God's plan is and command for us is to love our neighbor, to show that divine charity. And they asked the question of Jesus. They said, the Pharisees, and Jesus is teaching his disciples, and therefore this is us right here. They asked Jesus, the scholar of the law said, and who is my neighbor? Define that for me. Who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, glad you asked. And you must remember at the time of Jesus that there was the Jews and the Samaritans. And the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along very well at all. In fact, they hated each other. You know that, don't you? Huh? Something that we who read the Bible know. The Jews and the Samaritans have generations of hatred towards one another. In fact, if a Jew was traveling, he would go literally around Samaria rather than go through it. Like if you had to get to Boise from here, it's like you would go around Meridian in order to get to Boise, even if it took you an extra hour, because you would never go to Meridian, for example, because that's the Samaritan land. Isn't that crazy? That's how it was. And Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who's my neighbor? Glad you asked. A man was walking down the road and he got taken over by robbers and they beat him and left him half dead. Remember the parable? He's laying there half dead on the side of the road. And a Levite came by. I already told you who the Levites are. They're the priestly tribe of Israel. And the Levite went to the opposite side of the road and walked on. And then a priest came by, and he went to the opposite side of the road and walked on. And then a Samaritan came by, and the Samaritan bandaged his wounds, cared for him, put him on the donkey, brought him to an inn, paid for all of his health care. Remember the story? And then Jesus, turning back to this group over here, he says, so tell me, who was neighbor to the man who was injured? And this is fascinating. The Jewish men, knowing they were caught by Jesus, they couldn't say, oh, the Samaritan was the one who loved his neighbor. They couldn't even say the word. They just said, the one who showed mercy. He couldn't even say it was the Samaritan. And he's like, you got us, Jesus. My point is this. That's loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is being able to do good to those who hurt you. Love your enemy. It's in the Beatitudes. The Sermon on the Mount. So what I'm proposing to all of us is that we Christians restore this tremendous example of loving neighbor. Have we witnessed loving our neighbor? We've been witnessing the opposite in many ways of loving your neighbor. One of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, love him, he wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters. Maybe you've heard of that book, The Screwtape Letters. It's a great Lenten read. The Screwtape Letters, in summary, is a book, and there's two demons. There's two demons, and these demons are trying to get people to hell. And there's a demon who has an understudy. And this understudy, he's training this understudy and giving him advice how to get his human to hell. And the Screwtape Letters are all the letters that these demons write back to each other. And he's giving advice to his mentor on how to damn this human. And in one of the letters, the supervisor says to his mentor, his mentee, his name is Wormwood, my dearest Wormwood, he says, get your human to become very political. Get your human to become very political. Because if you do, he will begin to have a great desire and love for humanity, but he will hate his neighbor. He will develop a great love for humanity, but he will hate his neighbor. And I thought about that. What does that mean? And then I saw it on full display this last summer with the riots that were happening in our country. To have love for humanity or for a group of people, like let's say to end racism. So I saw videos of people protesting on behalf of minorities, which is, it's good to end racism, isn't it? But I saw a video of a person, out of love for a group, a white person standing in front of a black police officer, swinging and yelling profanities at this police officer standing in front of him. And I thought, that's it. Out of this love for humanity, I'm going to hate my neighbor, the person right in front of me. Jesus says, love your neighbor. Love the person right in front of you. That doesn't mean we don't care about the big group. We do. But we can never sacrifice love of the person who's right here. We can never sacrifice loving the person who's literally right here. Jesus commands us to. Our salvation is dependent upon love your neighbor. There are people out there who need to see that love is real. They're losing hope. There's people who are in difficult situations, people who have been stuck at home for a long time, people who have been battling lots of things. They need to know that love is real, that they're cared for. So who's going to do that? We should all raise our hands and say, that's us. We are Christians. That's the charge we've been given, to bring light back into the world, to be salt of the earth, to love our neighbor profoundly. And who's your neighbor? He's that guy that lives next to you that never rakes his leaves, and the leaves always blow into your yard, and his dog comes into your yard, and oh my, that's your neighbor. And you have to love your neighbor. Doesn't mean you have to be best friends with your neighbor. Doesn't mean you have to think like your neighbor, but we have to love our neighbor. Who's your neighbor? That person at work who has totally different political views from you. The Samaritan. Do you have to become best friends? Do you have to think like that person? And no. But I think there's this false sense in our culture that by loving somebody, you have to completely agree and accept everything that person thinks. No, that's a lie. It's a fallacy. Let's look at Jesus. He's always the example. How many times was our blessed Lord at a meal, at a home, and the Pharisees will say things like, does he not know who's touching him? Doesn't he know who he's with? Has he no idea who he's dining with? And they were scandalized because Jesus was with people who he shouldn't have been with. Now, Jesus was with tax collectors and prostitutes and sinners. Did he ever say that was okay? No. Does he agree with that? No. Does he love them? Yes. Did he save many of them? Yes. Love your neighbor. Hi, this is such an exciting time in the sense that, wow, Christianity is so needed in our world now. We have the answer. We just got to love in a profound way. Do we work for truth and justice? Yeah, we do all of those things as well. And so I've been asking myself this question, and I ask it rhetorically for you. Okay. Do I love my neighbor? Am I that kind of a person? But more profoundly, if there was somebody who was in great need, would that person ask me for help? If there was somebody who was in great need, would that person ask me for help? Today, the leper, the exiled, unclean leper, came to Jesus. The lepers who had to yell, "Unclean, unclean," and separate themselves. They were afraid to come in contact with people. They would be run out of town. And that leper felt comfortable enough to come to Jesus and say, "Jesus, if you will it, you can make me clean." He was comfortable to come to Jesus. Would somebody who's in a desperate situation feel comfortable coming to you? Wow, it's a good question. Are the fruits of the Spirit visible in my life? Peace, patience, kindness, joy. So my prayer for all of us today is that we would be those kinds of people. That those who might be in a difficult, desperate situation would feel comfortable to come to us, to be saved, literally. In speaking with a psychologist, she told me that if someone reaches out to you and someone's in that situation where they might be considering ending it, there's a 15-minute window. A 15-minute desperate window. And if you can get that person through that 15 minutes, he or she will probably be okay. But there's a moment there, 15 minutes, where that sense, that desire to end your life becomes very, 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 very strong. But it's only about 15 minutes, psychologist says. And so if someone sends you a text or someone calls you and says, "I think I'm going to do this," you have 15 minutes. And if that person responds to you, will that person respond to you? We have the ability to save lives, and we need to. Okay. I'll end with all this. I think of Jesus and the life and ministry that he modeled for us and the command he gave us. Love one another as I have loved you. That we would be the kind of people that the leper would be willing to come to. Our consistent example of love of neighbor will bear witness to the world of the love of God. Now is the time for Christianity, I believe, to rise again. And will rise again, I think, primarily through this kind of witness. So are you in? May it be so. And I pray, Lord Jesus, that if there's any way we can be your instrument and your presence in the world, so be it. Convert my heart. Lord, help me to love like you, to live like you, and by your will to save as you did.